Our mom of cancer, and our father immediately brought in a stepmother. They took our mother's jewelry worth $5 million. They us like servants, but we turned a grandfather, and then my grandparents, Jonathan and Margaret Livingstone, were one of the wealthiest families in Charleston. They lived in a grand old mansion, the kind of place that looked like it was straight out of a Southern romance novel. The house was enormous, painted a crisp white with dark green shutters and surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens. Inside, it was all marble floors, high ceilings, and sparkling chandeliers that seemed to glow with the family's long-standing reputation. Their pride and joy was their only daughter, my mother, Samantha. She was their world, their little princess, and they indulged her every whim from the day she was born. Growing up in that mansion, Samantha had everything she could possibly want, but she also had a streak of rebellion that couldn't be smoothed out by all the luxury in the world. She was headstrong and wild, a beauty with sharp eyes that seemed to defy the expectations her parents had carefully laid out for her. No one ever really told Samantha what to do, and if they tried, she'd quickly find a way to do the opposite. By the time Samantha turned 16, she was itching to break free from the life her parents had so carefully crafted for her. She had always been defiant, always looking for ways to push the boundaries, but that year, it was different. She was more restless, more determined, and one night, she packed her bags and ran away without a word. She left the mansion in the middle of the night, and when morning came, Jonathan and Margaret woke up to find her room empty, her bed untouched. My grandfather was furious. He searched high and low for her, using every connection he had, and within a few days, he managed to track her down. She was staying with friends in a rundown apartment on the edge of town, far from the opulent lifestyle she'd been raised in. Jonathan went to her, demanded that she come back home, that she forget about this foolish rebellion and return to the life she was meant for. But Samantha refused. She stood her ground, told him that she wasn't going back, that she wanted a different life, one that didn't involve following in his footsteps or living up to his expectations. Jonathan, not used to being defied, was livid. He gave her one last chance to come to her senses, to walk away from this nonsense and return to the family that loved her. She didn't budge, and with that, he turned his back on her. That day, Jonathan Livingstone made it clear that he no longer considered Samantha his daughter. He returned to the mansion and told Margaret what had happened, that Samantha was no longer welcome in their home. Margaret, on the other hand, couldn't let go so easily. She loved Samantha fiercely, and while she didn't approve of her choices, she continued to support her in secret, sending her money and letters, keeping in touch despite Jonathan's disapproval. 3 years passed, and Samantha stayed away, living her life on her terms. Then, one day, she showed up at the mansion, unannounced, with a young man at her side. His name was Thomas, a tall, lean guy with a confident air that seemed out of place in the Livingstone mansion. Samantha looked different, too. She was thinner, with a look in her eyes that I couldn't quite place, something hardened and defiant, yet vulnerable all the same. She told Jonathan and Margaret that she was pregnant. She said she had fallen in love, that she wanted to marry Thomas, and that she hoped her parents would support her. Jonathan, who had been waiting for any sign that Samantha might return to the fold, was furious. He didn't like Thomas, didn't trust him, and made no secret of it. He told Samantha that she was making a mistake, that she was throwing her life away for a man who couldn't possibly provide for her the way he could. But Margaret, my grandmother, couldn't bear to see Samantha cast out again. She pleaded with Jonathan, reminding him that Samantha was still their daughter, that she deserved a chance to be happy. She convinced him to allow a modest wedding, one that would give Samantha some semblance of a future, even if it wasn't the one they had planned. And so, they held a small ceremony, a far cry from the lavish celebrations that the Livingstone family was known for. After the wedding, Margaret persuaded Jonathan to buy them a small house in a quiet town upstate, away from Charleston and the prying eyes of high society. It was a humble place compared to the mansion, a modest little home in a town called Camden. It was there that Samantha and Thomas settled, away from the wealth and influence of the Livingstone name. Jonathan didn't approve, and he made that clear. He forbade Margaret from contacting Samantha, told her that if she wanted to stay in his life, she had to leave their daughter behind. But Margaret, who had always been strong in her own quiet way, continued to reach out to Samantha, visiting her in Camden, sending her letters, and making sure she had everything she needed. She would sneak away from the mansion, telling Jonathan she was visiting old friends, when really, she was making the drive upstate to see Samantha. The strain took its toll on Jonathan. He threw himself into his business, becoming more ruthless, more focused on power and wealth than ever before. He'd always been ambitious, but now it seemed like he was on a mission to prove something, to show the world that he didn't need anyone, not even his own family. He became cold, distant, a man obsessed with control and success. Margaret, meanwhile, became a shadow of the woman she once was. Jonathan restricted her movements, limiting the money she had access to, keeping her confined to the mansion. She stopped going out, stopped attending the social events that had once been the highlight of her calendar. She spent her days wandering the halls of the house, a ghost in her own home, holding onto the memories of a family that was slipping away from her. And so, the Livingstone mansion became a place of secrets and silences, a grand facade hiding the cracks that were widening with each passing year. Samantha stayed in Camden, raising her children, my sister Sherry and me, far from the wealth and privilege that had once been her birthright. We grew up knowing only snippets of the life she'd left behind, piecing together the story of our family from the fragments she would share late at night, when she thought we were asleep. Jonathan and Margaret became distant figures, their names whispered like legends, half-remembered stories from a world we'd never known. Samantha would talk about them sometimes, telling us about the mansion, the marble floors, the chandeliers, the gardens. She'd tell us about the life she'd left behind, but there was always a sadness in her eyes, a hint of regret that lingered in the spaces between her words. She'd thought she had married for love, but as the years went on, it became clear that life with Thomas was not the fairy tale she'd imagined. He was a good man, but life in Camden was hard, and the weight of the decisions she had made began to press down on her. She'd given up everything for freedom, but that freedom came with a cost, one that seemed to grow heavier with each passing year. For all her defiance, Samantha never went back to Charleston, never returned to the mansion. She stayed in Camden, raising us in that small house, teaching us about the world beyond the walls of the Livingstone mansion, about the life she'd chosen, and the one she'd left behind. 8 months after my parents' wedding, my twin sister Sherry and I were born. Growing up, we lived a life shaped by our family's choices and strained relationships. I'm married, and now I'm 27. The years have passed, but the memories of our family still linger, as clear as ever. Our grandmother, Margaret, would often visit us. She was a kind and gentle woman, but I could always sense something heavy in her presence. She loved my grandfather, Jonathan, deeply, but she was also afraid of him. There was a quiet tension in her, a sense that she was always walking on eggshells. Grandpa controlled every aspect of her life. He kept her in what she called a golden cage, where everything looked beautiful from the outside but was suffocating on the inside. Over time, that cage took away her vitality. She rarely left the house without him, and he kept a close eye on her finances, restricting what she could and couldn't do. When she did visit, she would often spend long hours just sitting quietly with us, as if our presence gave her some comfort, a brief escape from her life with Grandpa. Our mom, Samantha, was a fighter. She worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat. By day, she waited tables at a diner, serving regulars with a forced smile, moving from table to table as if on autopilot. At night, she switched to the grocery store, where she would stock shelves until the early hours of the morning. It was exhausting work, but she didn't have any other choice. She pushed through day after day, always putting Sherry and me first. Even when she was tired, she'd come home and check on us, making sure we were okay. The years of constant stress and double shifts wore her down. After 13 years of working herself to the bone, she began to show signs of strain. Her once bright eyes grew dull, and her shoulders slumped with the weight of everything she carried. But she never complained. She just kept going, as if sheer willpower alone could keep her going. Then one day, it all came crashing down. She had just started her shift at the grocery store when she collapsed. They found her lying on the floor in the stockroom, unconscious. They rushed her to the hospital, and Sherry and I hurried there as soon as we got the call. When we arrived, the doctors were running tests, asking questions that seemed to go on forever. They explained that she had cancer, that the years of stress and exhaustion had taken a toll on her body, breaking it down piece by piece until it couldn't fight anymore. Mom didn't have much time left after that. She grew weaker with each passing day, spending most of her time in bed. Sherry and I did our best to take care of her, trying to make her comfortable, to give her some sense of peace. Grandma came to visit, but she couldn't stay for long. She was torn between her love for us and the pull of my grandfather, who had never forgiven Mom for her choices. He didn't visit, didn't even call. Mom's illness meant nothing to him. She was already gone from his life, and now, it seemed like he was content to let her fade away. The day Mom passed away was quiet, almost too quiet. Sherry and I were by her side, holding her hands, telling her that we loved her, that everything would be all right. But when she took her last breath, it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. We were left alone, two kids without a mother, without a father, trying to make sense of a world that suddenly felt much colder and emptier. Grandma was devastated. She stayed with us for a little while, helping us navigate the immediate aftermath, but the day after the funeral, she had to return to Charleston. Grandpa had called her back, and she had no choice but to go. I didn't see her again for a long time. She was trapped once again in that mansion, cut off from the life she might have had if things had been different. Our father, Thomas, was a ghost in our lives. He had married Mom for money, hoping to gain some advantage from our family's wealth. But when Grandpa kicked him out, he lost any interest he might have had in us. He worked odd jobs here and there, never staying in one place for long. Most of his time was spent at the local bar, drinking with his friends, sharing stories about his so-called adventures. He liked to brag about his escapades, even though there was nothing impressive about them. One night, he showed up with a bruised face and a swollen lip, claiming he'd been in a fight with someone who'd insulted him. He told the story like he was some kind of hero, but I could tell he was just looking for attention. Another time, he came back with a cast on his arm, saying he'd gotten into a scuffle over a poker game. He was always looking for excuses to make himself seem important, but to Sherry and me, he was just a man who had checked out of our lives long ago. He disappeared for long stretches, leaving us to fend for ourselves. We didn't hear from him for weeks at a time, and when he did show up, he barely acknowledged us. He'd mumble a few words, maybe ask how we were doing, but it was clear that he wasn't interested in being a part of our lives. We were invisible to him, reminders of a past he'd rather forget. 2 days before Mom died, he reappeared. I was in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner when I heard the front door creak open. He stumbled in, looking worse than ever. His clothes were rumpled, his hair a mess, and he reeked of alcohol. He stood there for a moment, swaying slightly, as if he was trying to decide whether or not he wanted to stay. "Mary, Sherry," he said, his voice slurred. "Just thought I'd check in, see how you girls were holding up." We didn't say much. Sherry stood next to me, arms crossed, her expression blank. We were used to his sudden appearances, his half-hearted attempts at pretending he cared. I could tell he was looking for something, maybe sympathy, maybe forgiveness, but we had none to give. "I'm sorry, you know," he mumbled, not meeting our eyes. "I know I haven't been around much, haven't been the best father, but I just wanted you to know I'm here now." We stood in silence, letting his words hang in the air. There was nothing to say, nothing that could bridge the gap that had grown between us over the years. He stayed for a few minutes longer, awkwardly shifting from foot to foot, before finally turning and leaving. He didn't come to Mom's funeral. I didn't expect him to. He was gone as quickly as he had come, leaving us to pick up the pieces once again. After the funeral, Sherry and I were left to navigate the world on our own. We didn't see him again after that. He disappeared for good, leaving us with nothing but a few scattered memories and a lifetime of questions. He was just another ghost in a house filled with them, a reminder of the family we'd lost and the life we would never have. From as far back as I can remember, our mother always told Sherry and me to be careful and to stick together no matter what. She'd remind us that in this world, family was supposed to be our strongest bond. She would say it with a hint of sadness, like she knew how fragile that bond could be. After she passed away, those words stuck with us, and we tried our best to keep each other safe. But things became much more complicated than either of us could have imagined. Our father didn't waste any time. It felt like the moment the funeral ended, he already had someone new lined up. Her name was Linda, and she moved into our home almost immediately. I was shocked by how quickly she settled in, as if she'd been waiting in the wings, just waiting for her chance. One day, he told us she was our new mother, and that we should treat her as such. She had a daughter, Carla, who was around our age but seemed to lack any sense of awareness or responsibility. Carla followed Linda around everywhere, doing whatever she said without question. Our father continued to drink, disappearing for long stretches and only showing up when it suited him. He still worked odd jobs, sometimes not even coming home until the middle of the night. He barely acknowledged us, as if Sherry and I were just invisible. He was fascinated with Linda, doting on her in a way that made me sick. He'd call her beautiful and perfect, and then, in the same breath, he'd criticize our mother, saying she was worthless and ugly. He even admitted outright that he had only married her for the money, and that now, with Linda, he had upgraded. 6 months after our mother passed, we got word that our grandmother had died too. The doctors said it was a heart attack, but they also mentioned it had probably been brought on by years of stress and sadness. She'd lived with my grandfather's controlling ways, and after losing Mom, she had no one left. She never got the chance to see Sherry or me again, and I knew that was because she was afraid of what Jonathan might do if he found out she had stayed in touch. A few weeks after her death, we received a strange letter from her lawyer. It was addressed to Sherry and me, and inside was a note in my grandmother's handwriting, along with a small key. She wrote about how she'd always loved us from afar, even though she couldn't be with us. She said she regretted letting my grandfather keep her away, and that she wished things had been different. The note said the key was to a safe deposit box at a local bank and that inside, we'd find a collection of family jewelry. She warned us to be wise with it and to use it to help ourselves, not to squander it. She mentioned that the jewelry was worth around $5 million. Sherry and I stared at each other, not sure what to make of it all. We weren't sure what to do, but we knew one thing. We couldn't tell anyone, especially not Linda or our father. So, we went to the bank in secret and opened the safe deposit box. Inside, there were necklaces, bracelets, and rings, each piece more exquisite than the last. It was overwhelming, but also exciting. For a moment, we felt a sense of connection to our grandmother, as if she were reaching out from beyond to give us a chance. We decided to take just one small ring each, as a way to remember her and to keep something close to us. The rings were simple but beautiful, each with a single gemstone that sparkled in the light. It felt like a small way to honor her memory. We thought it wouldn't be noticeable, just a subtle change. But we were wrong. Linda noticed almost immediately. She was always so perceptive, especially when it came to things that didn't involve her. She saw the rings and started whispering to my father about how strange it was that we had jewelry all of a sudden. They both knew we didn't have any before, and her daughter Carla was quick to point out that she didn't have any jewelry of her own. Carla didn't seem to care much about anything, but when she saw Sherry and me with those rings, it was like a switch flipped. She was suddenly very interested in what we had, and I could tell Linda was fueling the fire. Suddenly, Linda and my father started acting differently toward us. They became overly friendly, asking us questions about our lives, pretending to care. It was a strange and uncomfortable shift, but Sherry and I knew better than to trust it. We tried to be careful, to avoid bringing up the jewelry or anything that might raise their suspicions. We didn't take anything else from the safe deposit box, not even when we visited it a few times to make sure it was still there. But Carla was relentless. She started following us around, watching everything we did. It wasn't long before she found out about the safe deposit box key. One day, we came home to find the key gone from its hiding spot. She must have seen us putting it away and taken it when we weren't around. The next thing we knew, Linda and our father were demanding we hand over the jewelry. They knew about everything, and there was no use denying it. They took it all. The necklaces, the bracelets, every last piece. Linda seemed to relish in it, taking each item out one by one, inspecting it with greedy eyes. My father just stood there, a smug look on his face, as if this was some kind of victory for him. We had no choice but to give them what they wanted. There was no way Sherry and I could fight back. They had all the power in that moment. After that, everything changed. Linda brought some guy over one day, introducing him as Carla's fiancé. He was a rough-looking character, bald, covered in tattoos, and with an attitude that made my skin crawl. They were suddenly planning a wedding, a big, extravagant event, complete with new furniture, expensive decorations, and anything else Linda could buy with the jewelry money. It was as if they'd hit the jackpot and were determined to flaunt it. With all these new plans, Linda decided that Sherry and I were taking up too much space. She moved us into a tiny room at the back of the house, barely big enough for the two of us. We'd been in our home for as long as we could remember, but now it felt like we were intruders. Our old room was given to Carla and her fiancé, and Linda started redecorating it to fit their taste. Everything was being done for Carla and her new life, while Sherry and I were pushed further into the shadows. Linda's attitude toward us became unbearable. She treated us like servants, barking orders and expecting us to do all the housework. She even made a point to remind us that we were lucky to have a roof over our heads, as if she was doing us some grand favor. Our father didn't say a word, just went along with whatever Linda wanted. He was completely under her spell, too absorbed in his new life to even notice the way we were being treated. Meanwhile, expensive things kept appearing in the house. There were new clothes for Carla, fancy dinners with all of Linda's friends, and even plans for a honeymoon for Carla and her fiancé. It was like they were living in some kind of twisted fairy tale, all at our expense. Every day, there was something new, some fresh reminder of what they'd taken from us and what they were willing to do to keep us down. Sherry and I had each other, and we kept our heads down, trying to stay out of their way. But it was impossible to ignore the reality we were living in. They had taken over our lives, turned our home into a playground for their greed, and there was nothing we could do about it. We were trapped, forced to watch as Linda and Carla flaunted their new wealth, while we did all the work behind the scenes. Sherry and I had had enough. Every day with Linda and Carla in control of the house was like living in a nightmare that we couldn't wake up from. It was Sherry who finally said what we both had been thinking, but were too scared to voice out loud. "We can't go on like this, Mary," she said one night after Linda had gone to bed, leaving us to clean up after another one of her dinners. "We have to be strong, and we need help. Grandfather is the only one who can put an end to this." The idea shocked me. We had never met our grandfather. He had cut all ties with our mom when she chose her own path, and he'd never reached out to us after her death. We knew from Grandma that he was a powerful and ruthless man, someone who always got what he wanted. But what choice did we have? Sherry was right. We couldn't continue living under Linda and Carla's thumb. We had to try. We planned carefully, deciding to go to Charleston the day before Carla's grand wedding. We had saved up a small amount of money and packed a bag with just the essentials. We didn't tell anyone where we were going, slipping out of the house early in the morning while everyone was still asleep. I couldn't help but feel nervous, wondering how our grandfather would react to seeing us, especially after all these years. But Sherry reassured me, saying that we had to try, that he was our last hope. When we arrived at his mansion, I could hardly believe my eyes. The house was enormous, with white columns stretching up to the sky and vast gardens surrounding it. We approached the gate, and I pressed the buzzer, hoping that someone would answer. After a moment, a guard appeared, looking at us with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "We're here to see Mr. Jonathan Livingstone," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "We're his granddaughters. It's urgent." The guard studied us for a moment before nodding and disappearing back inside. After what felt like an eternity, he returned and led us up to the front door. As we stepped inside, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of familiarity, as if we belonged there. The hallways were filled with paintings and sculptures, and the air was thick with the smell of polished wood and old leather. Finally, we were shown into a large study where our grandfather sat behind a massive desk. He was older than I'd imagined, with a stern face and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through us. For a moment, he just stared at us, his gaze intense, as if he were trying to make sense of what he was seeing. We stood there, unsure of what to say, but then I realized that he was looking at us the same way he might have looked at our mother. Sherry and I were tall and slender, with long blonde hair and the same sharp features that we knew our mom had. It was as if he were seeing her again for the first time. Finally, he spoke. "You must be Samantha's daughters," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "I never thought I'd see the day." We nodded, and Sherry stepped forward, her chin held high. "We need your help," she said, explaining everything that had happened since Mom died. She didn't leave out a single detail, telling him about Linda, Carla, the jewelry, and how they had taken over our lives. As she spoke, I watched his expression change. His eyes grew colder, his jaw clenched, and I could see a flicker of anger in his gaze. He didn't interrupt her, just listened carefully, nodding occasionally. When Sherry finished, he sat back in his chair, folding his hands in front of him. "So they thought they could steal from my family and get away with it," he muttered, almost to himself. Then he looked up at us, a steely determination in his eyes. "No one messes with my bloodline. I will make sure they pay for what they've done." He stood up, motioning for us to follow him. He led us down a long hallway to a room filled with books and papers. There, he called in a couple of men dressed in suits, his bodyguards, and began giving them instructions. He spoke in a low voice, but I could tell he was giving orders that would change everything. Within minutes, he had called his lawyer, a man named Mr. Harding, and arranged for a meeting at the house. His plan was already taking shape, and Sherry and I could only watch as he took control of the situation, just as we had hoped he would. The next day, we returned to our house with our grandfather, his bodyguards, and Mr. Harding. It was Carla's wedding day, and the house was bustling with activity. Linda and Carla had spared no expense, filling the house with flowers, decorations, and an assortment of catered food. I could see the shock on their faces when they spotted us standing there with Grandpa and his men. "What's going on here?" Linda demanded, her eyes narrowing as she took in the sight of us. "Why are you here?" Grandpa stepped forward, his gaze cold and unyielding. "I'm here to reclaim what's mine," he said, his voice carrying a weight that made the entire room go silent. "I know what you've done. You stole from my granddaughters, took what doesn't belong to you, and now it's time to pay." Linda paled, her eyes darting between Grandpa and the bodyguards. "I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, but it was clear she was lying. "Oh, I think you do," Grandpa replied, taking a step closer to her. "You're going to give back the jewelry, every last piece, and then you're going to pay for the trouble you've caused." My father appeared from the kitchen, looking confused and worried. "Jonathan, there's no need for this," he said, trying to sound calm. "It's all just a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding," Grandpa shot back, fixing him with a steely glare. "You've been stealing from these girls, from your own daughters, and I won't stand for it. You've taken advantage of them, mistreated them, and now it's time to face the consequences." Linda and my father exchanged a glance, fear evident in their expressions. They knew they were trapped, and there was no way out. Mr. Harding stepped forward, holding a stack of papers. "These are documents stating that you are to return the jewelry and any other assets you've taken from Mary and Sherry," he said, his tone formal and unyielding. "Failure to comply will result in legal action that you are not prepared to fight." Reluctantly, Linda led us to the bedroom where she had stashed the jewelry. She opened a drawer, pulling out a small box filled with the pieces she hadn't sold off yet. I recognized several of the items: the diamond necklace, the emerald brooch, the sapphire bracelet, all pieces that had once belonged to my grandmother. There wasn't as much as we had initially discovered, but the most valuable items were still there, untouched. Grandpa took the box from Linda, examining each piece before placing it in the hands of one of his bodyguards. He wasn't satisfied, though. He turned to my father, his expression hardening. "You're going to sell your house, Thomas, and give me every last cent," he said, his tone as icy as I'd ever heard it. "And you, Linda, will hand over any savings you have left. I don't care how much or how little it is. You don't deserve to keep a single dime." They protested, but Grandpa wasn't interested in listening. He had Mr. Harding draw up the necessary paperwork right then and there, forcing them both to sign. They had no choice. They knew Grandpa had the resources to ruin them completely, and they were too scared to fight back. Once they had signed the documents, Grandpa turned to Sherry and me, his expression softening for the first time since we'd arrived. "You're coming with me," he said, a note of finality in his voice. You deserve better than this, and I won't allow you to stay here another moment. We packed up our things, taking only what we needed. Linda and my father watched us go, a mixture of fear and resentment in their eyes. They knew they had lost, that their lives were forever changed, and that they had no one to blame but themselves. As we walked out of the house, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. We were finally free, and we were heading to a place where we would be valued, where we could start fresh. Back at the mansion, Grandpa welcomed us as his own. He made it clear that he intended to take care of us, to provide us with the life we should have had all along. We settled into our new rooms that were spacious and beautifully decorated, filled with light and warmth. For the first time in a long time, I felt safe, knowing that we were finally with someone who cared about us and would protect us no matter what. Life with Grandpa was different from anything we'd known. He was strict but fair, and he expected us to follow his rules. But he also gave us freedom, the kind of freedom we'd never had before. He made sure we were enrolled in good schools, that we had the resources to pursue our interests, and that we had the support we needed to thrive. Linda and my father faded into the background, their influence over our lives finally broken. They had taken everything from us, but in the end, we had come out stronger, with a new sense of purpose and a renewed bond between us. And as I looked around at our new home, I knew that we had finally found the family we were meant to have all along. If you like this story, subscribe right away and listen to new stories every day. Let us know what you like the most in the comments.